I'm Ryan Lindrosif. Welcome to Let's Think Digital. Today's episode of the podcast is going to be a little bit different than usual. It's going to be different because the format's going to be different. We don't have a guest this week. In fact, it's just going to be me sharing some thoughts with you directly. But it's also different because I've got an announcement to make. And I don't want to hold you in suspense, so let's just jump to the punchline. This is going to be the last episode of Let's Think Digital in its current format. And I know that's probably a little bit of a shock for you, comes a little bit out of the blue. So I want to explain why we've made that decision. Last month, I had the honor of being asked to join the Institute on Governance full-time as their Vice President of Learning and Leadership. The IOG is an organization that I've been working with for over 7 years now, and they are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's been around for over 30 years, focused on the mission of good governance practices and helping organizations across Canada and around the world be able to better serve the public interest. I'm really excited about this opportunity to jump into this new role, and it's been a busy few weeks already moving into it. But with this transition in my work, it naturally brought up the question of if this might be the same time to be thinking about the future of the podcast and where we go with it. You know, just over 2 years ago, in February of 2023, we launched the very first episode of the Let's Think Digital podcast. And the goal when we first launched the podcast was really to be able to elevate the conversation around a lot of issues that are very near and dear to my heart, to help us think about this issue around how government can better serve its citizens and better fulfill its public purpose in this digital age we're in. It's been a focus of my career for a couple of decades now, and it's something that I thought, particularly here in Canada, we didn't have enough voices speaking to. And so this podcast was really an opportunity to be able to step up and move it a little bit further. This is our 32nd episode of the podcast. And I feel like over the course of the last couple of years, we've been able to have a lot of really interesting discussions that I was hoping to have to be able to uncover some of these issues. We've had guests joining us from all over Canada and across the world. We've been able to grow our audience to thousands of listeners, not just here in Canada, but from dozens of countries. And I've really been heartened by the engagement that I think the episodes and the discussions that we've had have been able to engender with our audience. When I think about the arc of the last 3 seasons of this podcast, we really spent that first season thinking about digital government basics. What are the topics that people should be aware of? What are some of the new technologies that are impacting society? And what does this all mean in terms of the big trends? Our second season of the podcast, we really started zeroing in on this common refrain we were hearing that here in Canada, it kind of felt like we were stuck in the mud when it came to digital and that we weren't making progress as fast or as effectively as we'd like to be able to see. And this most recent third season of the podcast, our focus has really been on trying to think about ways to get unstuck, to talk to leaders both here in Canada and around the world about different approaches that have been taken to try help government modernize for the digital age and how we might be able to overcome what seem to be sometimes these very systemic barriers here in Canada. Now, the other reality of running a podcast like this is it's a big investment. It's a big investment in time, in energy, and in money sometimes as well. And that certainly was part of what factored into the decision behind deciding to close the podcast off with this current season. I'm eternally grateful to my good friend Wayne Chu, who's been my podcast producer was the person who really kind of, twisted my arm in the first place to say, Ryan, you've got to do a podcast, and I'm willing to step up and help you do it. And I know it's been a lot of effort and time on his part as well to pull everything together for these great episodes that you've seen for the last couple of years. And so I'm thankful to Wayne for all of his contributions to be able to help build and launch and run the podcast. But I'm conscious for all of us that it's a huge investment. And I felt that on the one hand, we had kind of told some of the stories that we already want to tell. But I think on the other hand, I'm also really excited that there's more voices stepping up in this space. And that's part of what has made this decision a little bit easier. That I think today, compared to even a couple of years ago, there are more people, certainly here in Canada and other voices around the world, who are talking about and trying to unpack and understand what it means for government in 2025 to be effective and to modernize and to be able to take advantage of the tools and possibilities that the digital age has opened up. I've had the chance in recent months to have conversations on some other podcasts that have been springing up talking about these issues, including my friend Derek Alton and his podcast, Civic Punks, which he's recently launched, as well as Nick Scott and Jason Perriman with the GovMaker podcast. And I know there are others in what I will call the digital government community that are increasingly publishing online or active online or going to be having new podcasts coming forward that I think are really going to add to the richness and diversity of the voices that are out there and hopefully be able to carry on some of these conversations for months and years to come. There's also, I should note, I think more interest in the media now on some of these topics than there has been before. I'm particularly happy to see Catherine May, who writes for Policy Options, with her new Functionary newsletter that really has actually put some coverage on the public service and the machinery of how government is working and been able to highlight some of the issues, particularly around digital modernization, that a lot of governments here in Canada are facing. A few weeks ago, I was excited to join Matt Galloway on CBC's The Current, talking about Estonia and the story about how they have been able to evolve their digital government journey over the last 3 decades and what some of the lessons learned for Canada might be from there. And, in addition to increased media chatter about some of these issues, I'm also just heartened to see that I think decision makers are bringing these issues much higher up on the agenda than it had been before. Certainly in the work that I do with governments at all levels, I think there's this realization that some of the emerging issues of the digital era are here to stay. They're having serious public administration consequences. And there does seem to be an awareness of the importance of this in a way that I think wasn't even true a couple of years ago. But in spite of all the good intentions, I do think we are still stuck in the mud here in Canada when it comes to digital, and stuck in the mud when it comes to governments in Canada modernizing for the digital era. It does feel like maybe there's some more hands pushing, and I'm encouraged that we may be able to see some progress in the months and years to come. Indeed, for a number of reasons, it really does feel lately like it's a time of transition. And, with this being the last episode of our podcast, today it felt like a good time to reflect and talk a little bit about transitions. Talk a little bit about, transitions, not just on a personal level, but how institutions and governments handle transitions in this rapidly changing space that we're in. So I want to talk about this first in the context of my own professional journey. For the last 25 years now, I've had the honor of being able to work with and for public institutions here in Canada and around the world. And in the various phases of my career, I think I've increasingly become interested and aware and passionate about the challenges that our institutions of governance are facing in our modern world. When I first started my career, I had worked with elected officials on Parliament Hill, on campaigns back home in Saskatchewan, where I'm from, had a chance to work with some international institutions like the World Bank down in Washington, D.C. And I think what I saw from all of this were a lot of people across all partisan lines who are passionate about trying to make government work and to be able to better the lives of their fellow citizens, but frustrated by systems and bureaucracies that frankly weren't up to the task in our modern era and weren't able to keep pace with the change that we're seeing in society. I'd gone back to do a master's degree in public policy and had the opportunity to do that at the Harvard Kennedy School, and was there right around the time that Barack Obama was making his first run for the White House back in 2008. And it was a really interesting moment because this is when people started talking about this concept of government 2.0, this idea that government in the social media era might look and feel somewhat different, that citizens and society had a way to be able to engage with each other and to organize and to influence government in ways that just weren't possible before because we had these powerful new technological platforms in front of us. And so I got fascinated by this notion of if some of these new online technologies might be part of the solution of reimagining what government looks like for the 21st century. I ended up focusing my academic work on this topic and had the opportunity to come back to Canada in 2010 to join Treasury Board Secretariat with the federal government and work for the Chief Information Officer for the Government of Canada. And as I was taking on that role for a number of years, I was leading policy work around social media, was looking at how we could use some of these online tools to better connect public servants and have them work more efficiently. Had an opportunity to go join the OECD for a year and work with their digital government team, engaging with governments around the world, understanding how they were stepping up to be able to meet this moment. And when I came back to Canada in 2016, this was in the early days of the Trudeau government. There was a lot of energy and excitement around trying to do something big on digital, and had this really unique opportunity to be able to help lead the process of creating the Canadian Digital Service, a special purpose team that we birthed out of Treasury Board Secretariat that was designed to harness the same approach that had been done in the UK and the US and elsewhere, and try bring in new ways of working and new types of talent into government to up our game and be able to deliver and develop and extend different types of digital services that were modern and more effective and were able to help improve people's lives. It was a really exciting time in the digital government space. I made the decision soon thereafterwards, though, to step out of government. And, that decision came for a number of different reasons. And I think, to be honest with you, part of it was I was tired. It was an exciting time in some ways in the digital government movement. We had just launched the Canadian Digital Service publicly. I think internationally, there was this growing community of people in governments around the world who were interested in seeing how we could evolve government, and were trying these new techniques and approaches to be able to make that happen. But for me personally, I think it also felt like we were starting to come up against some of the systemic barriers, and some of the early optimism of that government 2.0 era wasn't necessarily playing out the way I think some people had hoped. And it became really clear to me that there was this deeper level of transformation that governments need to be able to get to the modernized future vision that so many of us have for it. I've talked about on this podcast before my Pac-Man model for how government changes, and this idea that while culture eats strategy, there's two bigger fish in the sea, so to speak, and incentives eat culture and structures eat everything else. And I think for me, that was actually a lot of my impetus to step outside of the machine of government and be able to work as an advisor and a trainer from outside the system, working with public servants, was to say, how could we help inspire some work and attention coming onto those structural and incentive issues within our systems that I still passionately believe that we're going to have to be able to adjust if we're going to move forward in this space. And this has become more important than ever because I think we are very quickly moving certainly beyond government 2.0 and even beyond the digital government era. But when we talk about kind of modern government and modern public services, we are dealing with, number one, the negative externalities of the social media revolution, things like misinformation and disinformation that are frankly poisoning a lot of our public dialogue and making it difficult for us to reach societal consensus on some of the big issues that are facing us. We've got huge generational shifts happening in our society right now, and I think very different expectations from the newest generations who are coming into the workforce, who are becoming part of our democratic system, who have always grown up in a digital world and have different expectations for what their interactions with public institutions and what that type of responsiveness should look like in today's world. And then certainly the technology itself is starting to really push us in new ways. And I would say probably faster in some ways than we ever expected. And I think top of that list has to be artificial intelligence and the impact that AI is having on society, on having on people's personal lives, and certainly having on our professional lives. We're at this very unique moment where we've got this incredibly powerful technology that has a lot of hype around it. And I think it can be challenging for people sometimes to sort out the hype from the reality, but we know that something is very real going on there. And at a time of economic challenges and at a time of downsizing that we're seeing happening in governments here in Canada and elsewhere around the world, AI is being held up as a solution to the challenges we have around productivity and around fiscal imbalances. And while it might be part of that, and I think inevitably it's going to be changing the way the governments work, as we've talked about in a number of episodes on this podcast, there are some very complicated and challenging issues around that. And with powerful technologies like artificial intelligence, we've got to be able to make sure that it's being used and leveraged in a way that actually does support the public interest. And I think it just means that we have to be more prepared than ever. You know, I've always thought that we need to have leaders, both elected officials and public service leaders, who are fluent in the language of digital, who understand the reality of how technology works. Because as I've said before, every policy issue that government deals with today is ultimately a digital issue. And so to be able to be an effective public service leader, I think you have to have an understanding of how the digital world works and what the limits and possibilities of technology are. And frankly, to be able to call BS on something when you need to. I think this becomes part of that core competency that we need in government. And it occurs to me that we're at a unique political moment right now here in Canada. In the next few weeks, we're going to have a new prime minister and likely within the next few months be going into federal elections. And this is a consequential time as citizens and voters and political parties are outlining their vision for the future of Canada and our place in the world. A lot of the givens that we've had, a lot of the assumptions that we hold to be true about not just how Canada works, but how Canada interacts with its neighbors and with other countries around the globe, suddenly seem to be uncertain for the first time in many, many years. And part of that mix is the role that technology is having on changing the way we communicate, changing the way government works, and changing the expectations that citizens and society have of what good government looks like in 2025. I think we've got to be prepared for this moment. And I'm a believer that we need to have strong and flexible and adaptable institutions of governance if we're going to be able to rise to the challenges that we face in today's world. But that doesn't mean that institutions should be sacred unto themselves. They have to be of service. And I think that's the real tension that we're facing right now, is that our systems of government that in many ways have served us well for hundreds of years have failed to be able to evolve as fast as society is evolving around us. And this, I hope, is going to be part of that conversation that happens over the coming months here in Canada, and I think over the coming years around the world, which is how do we actually build a cross-partisan consensus that says this is important, that if we're going to build trust in government, if we're going to build trust in society, we have to have a modern government that's able to deliver for citizens in this digital world we're in. And I'm convinced that we're never going to be able to get there in Canada unless we can build significant and sufficient and sustained political will to be able to move us forward. I think it's possible. I'm hopeful. And I actually think in times of change and transition is where the greatest opportunities for change happen. And I think the question for all of us then becomes, if we care about these issues, how do we best take advantage of these times of change we're in now and be able to harness it? It's certainly for me something I'm going to be thinking a lot about and be top of mind for me as I start digging into my work with the Institute on Governance and looking at how do I continue being able to help support those who work in and with the public service to be able to deliver for Canadians and be able to strengthen their institutions so that we can rise to the moment that we find ourselves in today. So as we bring this final season of the podcast to a close, I want to just take a minute to thank the dozens of guests who've been a part of this podcast over the last 3 seasons. We've had an incredible variety of guests joining us who've worked in government and with government and are innovators in a variety of fields. I've learned a lot from the conversations, and I sincerely thank all of them for having taken the time to be able to share their experience and perspective with all of you. And I hope that we are all a little bit richer for having those discussions and conversations. I'm also very grateful to my colleagues at Think Digital who joined us in a variety of episodes as co-hosts and as guests to be able to share their perspective. And of course, I want to thank my team. I'm incredibly grateful to Aislinn Bournay and Mel Han and Rebecca Howlett, who all contributed in a variety of ways throughout the course of this podcast to help launch it and sustain it over the last couple of years. And again, I have to give a huge debt of gratitude to my partner in crime on this, my friend Wayne Chu, who's been our podcast producer since the beginning. I think back to a dinner that Wayne and I had at Forward 50 2.5 years ago now up in Ottawa, where we made the decision to actually launch this podcast. And I think at the time, it was an experiment to see if there was interest, to see what would happen. And we've both been incredibly grateful for the response we've had from so many of you who've been able to listen to us from around the world. And we're still hoping to be able to bring the occasional episode or commentary to you and to share content from our networks. So please say subscribe to us on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform. We're hoping over the months to come, we'll occasionally have a special podcast drop or a special episode that we can share from some of our networks and be able to still find ways to keep you engaged in the conversation. And most importantly, I just want to thank all of you for listening and for watching over the last couple of years. It is incredibly humbling that people would take time out of their busy days to add us to your rotation of news and podcasts that you listen to. I sincerely hope that you found some real value from the episodes you listened to and from some of the information we've been able to share. I hope it's inspired you. I hope it's helped you to think differently about some of the issues we're facing. And most importantly, I hope it's been a little bit of a call to action and helps to motivate all of you who I know are working in so many important ways at different levels of government here in Canada and globally to try make things just a little bit better for the citizens that you serve. So thank you again, everybody, for being part of our community here at Let's Think Digital. And as always, until next time, let's keep thinking digital.